if React is the world that you live in, then HTMX seems like a big step back for something that most people don't care about, which is I can use a UI library, some data, Zod to do validation and a bunch of other things, and just make something very, very quickly, and probably get ChatGPT to help me out along the way if I wanted to. Where HTMX, yeah, you might be more of the Linux graybeards who are just like, oh, the good old days when REST ruled. I think they're both completely viable.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks for staying with us while we went dark last week. I took the kids to Disneyland, had a great time, so that was a lot of fun. And always, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends and coworkers. If you're on an audio platform, leave a 5-star review. It really helps. We do see all of your comments that you put. We would love to respond individually to each one. We don't always get around to that, but we do appreciate hearing from you guys. We especially appreciate hearing your hot takes. We have some hot takes ourselves, and probably will have some hot takes on this podcast. But please keep supporting the podcast. It really means so much. And we are covering this week, we're actually doing the second half of Hypermedia Systems. Not the second half, it's like the second 2/3 with me being at Disneyland last week, and we were off for 2 weeks. We had actually time to read the whole book, the rest of the book. So we thought, you know what, let's just cover it all in one episode. We think we can tackle it. So just to give you an overview again on Hypermedia Systems, this is by Carson Gross, Adam Stepinski, and Deniz Akşimşek. Hypermedia Systems, it is what it sounds like. They describe it as a simpler approach to building applications on the web and beyond with a framework or a library they've created, HTMX and Hyperview. They argue it's an alternative to using SPA, single page application frameworks. And they say that it really builds on the revolutionary ideas that empowered the early web, which is the exchange of hypermedia across computers. Just give some quick background on our authors. Carson Gross, he is a software developer, university lecturer, and creator of HTMX and another library, intercooler.js. I've never used that one personally. Adam Stepinski, he worked at InstaWork as the director of engineering. He's the creator of Hyperview. And Deniz Akşimşek, he's a software engineer building high-fidelity web applications that are reliable and accessible. So that's one thing I really like about this book. These guys are software engineers just like us. As fun it is to read something by a Brian Kernighan or a Stephen Wolfram or a John Osterhout. It's also really cool to read something by people who aren't as credentialed and just see that there are a lot of really cool, really smart ideas from regular Joes and Jills, just like the rest of us. So we wrapped up the book this week. Nathan, what are your thoughts on the back half of Hypermedia Systems?
Yeah, so we were talking about this week. This was a slog. So we've talked about it in the books, and we've even interviewed authors, and I was like, oh, why do you put the philosophy part later in the book? Like a lot of, we asked about this to Kent Beck and others, and now I understand why. Because we read the philosophy first, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I'm here for. And then it was just like a ton of implementation stuff where you're like, let's build an app together. And then they did pepper really interesting insights while we're building things. But there's a lot of like, look at this Django code and look at what it does with this template over here. And I'm like, okay, I'm following it, but goodness, like this is a lot. I will also say the rabbit hole keeps getting deeper, and I do feel like while I agree with a lot of I love the simplicity of hypermedia. I think that the Roy Felding focus that they have is like his little hot takes that kind of are out throughout the book on why everyone's doing REST wrong and that kind of stuff is really funny. The further we get down the pipeline, it's like, wait, this is how we're supposed to develop code.
Yeah.
This is, and so, yeah. I'm a huge fan of Hypermedia. I really love a contrarian hot take. There are some things, like some stuff that's a hard pill to swallow, like the hyper scripting. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. So what about you?
Do you like Visual Basic? We recreated it, but it's JavaScript this time. It's not exactly that, but we talked about this last week on the podcast. So I guess two things. We've talked about before on the podcast that some books are just not meant to be read cover to cover. That is not the fault of the book. It is just a conflict we have with this podcast format. We can't do this podcast in any other way aside from reading books cover to cover. So occasionally we find a book that I think the first stuff that we read last week, that's a good cover to cover read. That gives you the philosophy of hypermedia, a crash course on how you build an app with HTMX. This back half is more reference material and kind of like, okay, if you really want to know a lot about hypermedia, I mean, these are some other things you can do with it. This would kind of, yeah. Like you said, it doesn't make for a great cover to cover read. But it's this book, it often anticipates my arguments and will immediately have a section addressing them. Like I don't think I'm not sold on a lot of what they are trying to teach here, but it is very well written. Like that's one thing, talking about hyperscript, where hyperscript is supposed to be kind of more like natural language.
Right.
And I'm just like, oh gosh, like another natural language programming language. Like these things never work. And like I turn the page and immediately it's like, now you may have some skepticism about natural language programming languages. Right. I'm like, all right, okay. These guys are, you can tell these are very, very intelligent fellows. And, it's good to see a book written by smart, passionate people that are arguing for something they believe in. Now, I mean, I'm still a React guy. I still think, a SPA is going to be the right choice 99.9% of the time. But I appreciate hearing other perspectives. And we'll talk about this as we go through our stuff. Their main argument that I kind of bought in the beginning is they say, okay, any given project has a complexity budget, right? Like how complex it can get. Spend your complexity budget on the back-end business logic, and then, or just the back-end logic in general, and then you can just have this really thin, really easy hypermedia solution up front. I'm like, okay, I get it. And then as it went on, I just felt like hypermedia and HTMX just became more and more complex to the point where I'm like, I'm not sure this is any simpler than React. And granted, they say in the book, I think by the time they were showing some of the really complicated stuff you can build towards the end, even they were saying like, now this is a bit of a stretch, and really you probably want to have a single page application for this. But just so you know, you could do it in HTMX.
Do it this way.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, it's like going on a road trip and your partner's trying to sell you on a tandem bicycle. And say, well, okay, just so you know, like we could attach a rocket booster to the tandem bicycle, like, or we could just take a car.
Right.
So yeah, it's very interesting. I don't think I'm quite sold on this, but I appreciate a good argument from passionate people. And like Kent Beck says, he says theory is important. It lets you argue with your fellow nerds more effectively, right? And so now, if someone comes up to me recommending, hey, we got to do this HTMX thing, I'll say, I read the book on HTMX, and let me tell you why I think we should stick with React. So it's an exposure to a different viewpoint. I can't fault them for that. Well, I mean, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the back half of the book. Like we said, this is a book club masquerading as a podcast, not a book report masquerading as a podcast. So we're not going to talk about everything in the back half of the book, but we will talk about the ideas that are most interesting to us, and we'll have fun with it. So just stick around, and we're going to let you know all of our thoughts on the back half of Hypermedia Systems right after this break. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, let's just get right into it. HTMX, Hypermedia Systems. Nathan, just tell me, what's something from this back half of the book that really stood out to you that you think would make for a good discussion?
Yeah, so where we left off last week, we had started talking about the HTMX patterns that they were advocating. And so they were starting to introduce these ideas of, you can use these little annotations on any tag, and give them hypermedia functionality, right? So I could post or get or put, and then have a target, have a trigger, have these behaviors that I can make anything sort of hypermedia, swappable. And they start getting into this next section of talking about like these more advanced patterns you can do. And again, this book progressively goes forward, and one of the concepts they bring up is progressive enhancements. And I think in the HTMX community, especially, this is like a big deal. I think it's interesting. I think if something like the concept of progressive enhancement is interesting to you, this is actually a topic that's worth visiting with the hypermedia methodology of the HTMX, or however you pronounce that longer piece, and REST. And again, for the uninitiated, what is progressive enhancement? Progressive enhancement is this idea that like the website should function in a minimum form, even if you have no script turned on, right? So you can actually do this. It's very uncomfortable if you make this happen, but there's a tool called NoScript that will disable JavaScript on a web page. Most of the internet will not work with modern internet. But let's say, imagine that you wanted someone to be able to, do a really basic HTML form submit, and, interact with your server on some basic way. Well, maybe we allow this to happen. And then the progressive enhancement be that maybe they do have JavaScript turned on, and now we can do some of the fancier HTMX, fragment replacement stuff that they're advocating. But that it should degrade down to something that's still functional, even though it may not be aesthetically pleasing or fun to use.
I thought this was one of the worst arguments in the book, to be totally honest, with progressive enhancement. They just keep throwing about, and they say like, and if someone doesn't have JavaScript enabled, like, okay, who is it, guys? Go find me the guy who doesn't have JavaScript enabled in their browser.
Oh, I can find you like an Emacs GNU Graybeard who is, out of principles.
And he should get with the times.
Right. Out of principles. I actually heard that this is like a little side thing. And this may not be true anymore, but years and years ago, Richard Stallman, who is the creator of GNU, and is a very important part of like what makes Linux command line tools and a bunch of the other stuff that Linux outside of the kernel, a lot of it was the GNU part. But he didn't like privacy, the way that the privacy was not honored on the web. And he had like a tool that would scrape web pages and then email them to him. And he would like read it out of his inbox. Like that's how he would browse the web. So when I think about progressive enhancement, I'm like, this is a Richard Stallman feature. Yeah. Let this guy submit to a form, okay?
This kind of reminds me of like, I like watching like YouTube chefs. That's how I got into cooking, and so there's a lot I really like. One of the ones I really like, his name's Joshua Weissman, and I got into him because he has this whole series called But Better, where he will take fast food items and then recreate them at home, right? And then try to make them better, right? I think it's really fun. I have had for like dinner parties, I've made like homemade Chick-fil-A nuggets, right? Or homemade Taco Bell or whatever. And like, it's fun because it reminds you of the food, but it's the quality of like a homemade meal. And so it's really cute. And I learn a lot of like cooking techniques from it. I like it. Sometimes he gets a little too high on his own supply. And it's like, oh man, we crushed Taco Bell. I'm like, hey, dude, Taco Bell gave me my food 2 minutes after I asked for it, right? You just spent 3.5 hours making this. Like, right. I feel that way with, I don't know. Some of these things like I'm kind of like anti-Linux, or not anti-Linux, right? But I've heard people say like Linux is only free if you value your time at 0. I like when like someone hands me like a Mac and like it just works. So I'm not bought in on a lot of this like, here's why you'd want to disable JavaScript. I'm like, I cannot imagine the trade-offs here are worth it. But I don't know. Sell me on it. If you're in the comments, yell at me about why.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I actually did this thought experiment. And so I think maybe one of the reasons I'm like a big fan of this thought experiment was years ago. I think it was probably like four years ago or so. I actually have a little open source project called Lift Plan. And I wanted, this was the ridiculous constraint. I wanted to pay $0 a month but I wanted liftplan.xyz. It's like the most brutalist thing, but liftplan.xyz would let me do these 7-week lifting cycles for powerlifting. I was doing bench press, overhead press, back squat, and deadlift. Those are like the four.
Liftplan.xyz. You wanted this domain name?
I have liftplan.xyz. Yeah, that's
okay, but you wanted to pay $0 a month for the
No. Sorry, I'm willing to pay. I'm not going to tell you how much I pay for novelty domain names per year, but I will.
Remind me, I have an embarrassing anecdote about this.
Yeah. So anyway, I built this little tool, but it has no JavaScript like at all.
Oh, interesting.
And I used some like weird CSS hackery to like hide form fields, and I also didn't want to have a database. So it's entirely functional in that you can anything in the form field will get submitted, and then in the response there's the HT there's a URL encoded response, and as long as you like save that response, you have your 7-week lift plan. So the response is the stateful database output basically. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to build this in Go. I'm going to put this in Lambdas so that I basically pay it, like the 3 requests per month or something that I might use to pull it up is all I'm paying for. It was like a ridiculous experiment, but it was also really interesting how difficult it was to build server-side templates and do all the rendering and figure all this stuff out. I didn't have HTMX at the time. I didn't know about it. I don't know if it actually existed at this point. And anyway, it was really interesting. And so I had a bit, because I also was like, I want to be able to submit a lift plan from curl. That was the other like ridiculous thing. I was like, I want to be able to, from the command line.
Your users are really going to appreciate this functionality.
Yeah. See, so I'm like a proto HTMX fanboy because I did this ridiculous project. And so I look at this and go, oh, this is like actually a very interesting perspective. And I might actually go back and rewrite lift plan using HTMX. Like it would be an improvement over what I was doing before. But yeah, so progressive enhancement was something interesting to me. So like if you actually had JavaScript disabled, my liftplan.xyz is one of the few websites on the internet that would actually still function. Even if you had CSS disabled, and it was ugly, forms would still submit, right? Like the things still work. And I think that's interesting. It's an interesting thought experiment because it sounds weird. As ugly as it is, it's actually user-centric in that my web page, unlike most modern JavaScript, will probably run 20 years in the future, right? Like where if you're writing React stuff now and you've got some big compile step, you're probably going to have a ton of CVEs to deal with. You're probably going to have like JavaScript that's not supported. Like it's like the equivalent of IE 11 or IE 10 or whatever, IE 6, where like they just quit. They just deprecate stuff, right? And so if you're doing one of these things where you're like, well, a weird little project that I don't want to ever support. And the thing is, I wrote that code 4 years ago. It has worked flawlessly. I've done years worth of lift plans with this thing and never thought about the code again, to the point where I just looked at my code the other day and I'm like, what mad science was I doing? I mean, it's ridiculous, like what I wrote into it to like get this all to work. And yet it works. Like I've been like without fail. And the other one is I want to be able to print these out. So like the results is HTML that is like printable because it's just black and white and very like I wanted to put 4 to a page and print it out. And then I literally have like I visit this website like once every 7 weeks and print out a new set. And so anyway, if you're a crazy person like me, HTMX, you're high on the horse. Like that is a nice set of tools to do stuff with.
I have a few other thoughts on progressive enhancement, but I have to share my embarrassing novelty domain name story. I saw on Twitter the other week a website called dropcatch.com. Have you heard of this website?
No.
Okay. So this is a website that when domain names expire, like popular domain names, they scoop them up and then put them up for auction. I saw this on Twitter because spend.com had expired and the person forgot to renew it. And spend.com went for about, I think, $350,000 on dropcatch.com.
And you bought it?
No, I did not buy. I did not buy spend.com.
I was like, man, I'm in the wrong line.
I sold my house.
Yeah, right.
This is a set in a storage unit. No, so But I was like, okay, like, and I was looking through the domain names. I'm like, there are a lot of domain names here that, like, if I scoop this up for $50, I could sell to a business for $200, right? I'm like, this might be like like, I don't mind doing a bit of a cold emailing. Like, I might be able to make this. So I went a little nutso on bidding on things, kind of assuming I would get outbid, and I didn't get outbid. And I wound up, like, I'm just getting all these emails like, congratulations, you won this domain name. And the moment I won it, I was like, I don't want this crap, but I can't not buy it. It's a binding contract. So here are the domain names I now own. RockvilleGarageDoorRepair.com, PortlandTaxAttorneys.com, PrimeBrisket.com, SkiGadget.com. And then I had two others. What do I have? ItIsNotReal.com. And okay, I think that's the only other one I have.
So I'll tie this into a DEF CON talk that I just watched not very long ago. A lot of InfoSec hackers love to scoop these up as well, and they will literally just put a HTTP server that will log everything that tries to hit it. So like over all the major ports, so like email ports, web ports, some other things, and just see what's on the internet that's trying to reach out to it. And it's absolutely crazy what like stuff people leave up. Like, SAML connections and all kinds of other weird things. Some of them are of course used for like callbacks to all kinds of weird command and control things. And anyway, it's actually like for like forensics and stuff, people who are like, what was this website used for? Pretty interesting. Of course you're going to get a bunch of scrapers and bots and stuff, but yeah.
Hey, if you ever see me in person or run into me online, if you want to show you're a true fan of this podcast, don't say, hey, are you Carter Morgan from Book Overflow? You say, hey, are you Carter Morgan, the owner of PrimeBrisket.com? That's what I want to hear from you guys. And if you want to buy PrimeBrisket.com from me, it's for sale.
That would be a great like computer consulting company, just because it's like
Prime,
instant logo. You're Prime. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like
that's
you got to work with Prime Brisket. They're like the top HTMX developer in the world.
So just a few thoughts on progressive enhancement before we move on. So one, even though I kind of like progressive enhancement, I'm a little like, guys, just use JavaScript. But I do like any philosophy that is user-centric, and that is progressive enhancement. You're incurring cost on your end to provide a better experience for your users, whatever small subset they may be. So I appreciate any philosophy with the user at its heart. But also say that like one of my favorite kind of like weird niches in, I guess it's not that weird, in web development is I really like front-end web development for internal tooling. Because when it's internal tooling, you don't have to support all of the different browsers and every possible configuration someone might access your website. I remember at my first job, we had, that was one of the things I did is I created UI web components that we would then, that other companies in the team could use, that the components conform to the company style guide. And so, it saved the teams a lot of time. But we would have like a bug tracking sheet for each component and be like, yeah, but is it working on Internet Explorer 7? And like that drove me nuts. And then at that same company, I got moved to, we were building an internal system, and I'm building an internal system now. And like, we just tell people like, just use Chrome. Like we don't even try to see if this works on other websites. We just tell you, you're using our tool, use Chrome. So, I mean, progressive enhancement just gives me like nightmares of that UI web component suite I worked on, where like you had to spin up a virtual machine that was running Internet Explorer to test your stuff. And like, I hate that kind of stuff. So, I appreciate it. It's always good to put your users first. From a developer experience standpoint, it's really nice when you can write front-end web code and say, we only care that it works on like the most updated version of Chrome.
And I think this is actually a really great case if you are, and I think this actually comes to the difference between two pretty popular YouTubers in our space. The Prime Eigen, he is a big HTMX fan. Actually, he's had Carter Gross on, and he's just like, hey, if I'm doing Go on the back end or Python on the back end, and I just want to spin up some internal thing for folks to use, and I'm already comfortable building web servers in Go, then having a kind of terse HTMX, interface that I can spin up really quickly, get folks internally using the tool, and then move on is a great use case, right? Like if my team is the one owning it and we don't have a bunch of folks like product managers and UI people and stuff like that. The other one is Theo, who's T3, right? T3.gg. Theo is a big React guy. And while he's talked about this, like he doesn't hate HTMX, but he definitely thinks of it as this like odd thing that exists and like why, because React and Next.js are so powerful and they have such huge communities, and you can just, if you're comfortable in TypeScript in the front end, you're so productive. Like you just spin your stuff up. You probably got a stack. You probably can have a template and just like make it happen. And I think that's true, right? Like if React is the world that you live in, then HTMX seems like a big step back for something that most people don't care about, which is I can use a UI library, some data, Zod to do validation and a bunch of other things, and like just make something very, very quickly, and probably get ChatGPT to help me out along the way if I wanted to. Where HTMX, yeah, you might be more of the Linux graybeards who are just like, oh, the good old days when REST ruled, like I think they're both completely viable. I actually mentioned that I was playing with HTMX. I'm like, yeah, it's cool because I don't have to write JavaScript. And I got well actually. And they're like, well, actually, isn't HTMX a JavaScript library? And I was like, yes, you're right. And it was funny because in the very end of this section, they go, well, obviously HTMX is written in JavaScript, but you know what we mean. And that's exactly like how I responded. It's like, I didn't have to write JavaScript. Like I just used this one-liner import, and that's what I wanted to do. Like I just wanted to make a silly to-do app and have something like handle some basic abstraction for me. So
I think one thing I like about React as opposed to HTMX, and opposed to Angular, was my biggest takeaway, because I started out, my first front end framework was Angular.
Yep.
Angular is a lot more prescriptive than React. Like if you want to do a loop, like make a loop of an element, there's kind of like an Angular syntax you have to do to make that happen. I was shocked when I did React, and it was like, hey, you have this array and you want to create an element for each one. Like you do array.map, and the return is JSX, right? Which for all intents and purposes, it looks like HTML. And I was shocked. I was like, holy cow. So I really, really appreciate the expressiveness of React, and HTMX feels a little more prescriptive.
Yep.
But it's, And
I think that's the other thing. The React community kind of looks at it and goes, wait, we've been doing HTML fragments forever, right? Like the whole point of JSX is that you make little components of little chunks of HTML, and again, the cognitive load for React for folks who aren't React developers is that you're really thinking about the way that data flows, right? Like you're trying to make it so that you have this cascading set of reactions that go down and minimize the number of loopbacks that something further down changes state globally, or does like you run into these weird problems where you're like mutating state for parallel things or these other things. That's where React gets crazy. I like React, especially when React adopted hooks, which is years now. But I was at a startup. I was CTO at this early stage startup when we had made the transition from Angular to React, when React was still class based, because everything was class based, and it's like, well, yeah, this is like the future of transpiling JavaScript or whatever, because classes aren't real in JavaScript. They're really, or at least they weren't at the time. It was all prototype syntactic sugar. But hooks are nice because it's all functional programming stuff, and you realize that functional programming patterns in React are really nice together. But yeah, obviously you can take React too far, right? You can take HTMX too far. It's funny, as much as I like React, I think that there's a world in which these two can complement one another, which is that, like, again, I think you should think about server-side rendering. You should say, like, is this appropriate to do in the client versus is this appropriate to do in the server? And what do I lose if I do it in one versus the other? Like, these are interesting. And we see React is doing this, right? So the other thing that this book doesn't really bring up is that a lot of SPAs are using server rendering frameworks now. I mean, React now has server components. Like, that is a complete shift. And again, it's a cognitive load. If you try using most recent versions of Next.js, people get very confused when they're like, oh, wait, is this a server rendered component? And then it turns into regular HTML. And then can I put a child, like it's like all these weird, they're still cool. And there's reasons to do this. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I thought they mentioned later in the book, they're kind of like, well, and you could have a combination of HTMX and React. I'm just like, but then the complexity budget argument goes out the window, because the moment, like, even if this subsection of the app is theoretically simpler than it could be in React, the cognitive overload or overhead of switching in between two frameworks on the same project is not going to, I just think that is just going to wipe out any gains you make from making one half simpler, because it's HTMX. And I'll also say this, someone in the comments had mentioned last week, see, we read your comments and we think about them. Yeah. Because I had mentioned, I'm like, you have to retrain everyone who joins your company that's all bought in on HTMX. They're like, hey, any developer worth their salt can learn this framework in a week. And you know what? Out of the first 150 pages we read, the one we covered, last week in the podcast, I agree. I agree that, that I would expect any developer worth their salt to be able to pick that up. As we got further into the book, I was a little like, I don't know, guys. Like, I think we're getting about as complicated as React here.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. Should we talk about some of that about scripting?
So I think there's a couple things as we get into, and again, I think they do this kind of, some of it I think is to kind of like, like in the infomercials, and they're like, are you tired of, cutting your own vegetables? And you're like, the vegetables are flying everywhere. Some of this felt like that, where you're like, look, plain old JavaScript. Let's see what this does. And you're like, I don't want to do that. And they're like, that's why alpine.js exists. And they're like, but that's why hyperscripting exists. And you're, so I do think that like some of it was set up to be like, look how simple it is to do this one toy thing. Yeah. Before we get to that though, I actually want to bring up, I did not know, of course, a hypermedia book's going to teach me things that I just didn't know about web standards. I didn't know about the HTTP header of content disposition. Did you know about this?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So I was like, I ended up researching it on, like the HTTP docs and stuff. But yeah, so content disposition, we're now talking about this like dynamic archive UI. There's like this whole section of the book on like, what if I want to export my contacts and, have it in a downloadable format that I can, have or whatever. And he's like, you don't want that to just load as a page render. You want that to be, tell the browser that that it's a download link. And I'm like, you can do that?
Yeah.
I think it must be done automatically by a bunch of frameworks. But yeah, you put a little header and it tells the browser, it's called content-disposition. And it lets the browser know this is actually a downloadable file. This is not something meant to be rendered in the browser. And I was just like, that's cool. Like, even if I didn't walk away with anything else, I'm like, I'm going to use that one day. That'll be nice.
That's a great thing about this book too, is like these guys have a really great understanding of hypermedia, right? And whether or not you're sold in HTMX, I mean, hypermedia HTML is still the basis of all of the web, right? Even if you're writing JSX, it's just ultimately compiling, into, or I guess rendering as HTML. And like their understanding of like HTTP and the different HTTP headers and, how that happens. I mean, that was when I started my master's degree, I remember just one of the reasons I went is I was doing fine in my career without having a master's degree. I mentioned on the podcast, I have a bachelor's in computer science, a bachelor's in business management. I have a minor in computer science. And so I want to get a master's in computer science because I was doing fine in my career, but I just kind of felt like, there are some fundamental aspects of computer science that I feel like I don't understand. And I feel like having a formal education in them would benefit me. And one of those was computer networking. I was just like, listen, I can make a web app. I don't know how the internet works. Yeah. I don't know how something gets from an Amazon server farm in Virginia to my computer in Utah. So that was my first class, the computer networking class. I really enjoyed it.
I loved that class. I took that.
Yeah, it's a good class.
I already knew a decent amount about networking. But I wanted to like understand the form, what I called the ivory tower knowledge. So it's like, what is the distributed algorithm for solving the shortest
BGP
distance? Right, exactly.
And so like I like, there's value in getting stuff done. There's a lot of value in just getting something done and shipping it. But
Yep.
I think we all know, like when we work with a developer who really deeply understands a framework or how the, how their tools work, like it's really, really cool. And so reading this, like it's really cool to, I mean, these guys are passionate and they have a very, very good understanding of how hypermedia is exchanged across the internet. And they're introducing new headers to us. What was the HTTP content disposition? Was
Yeah,
that the header?
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah.
Another one that, again, in this section, before we get into the scripting stuff, I loved, and this is speaking to me because my current company, we build this, like, we have this markdown renderer that actually is a big security thing that we let anyone build markdown that they want for certain pages that they're rendering that are like based off of smart contracts and stuff. But he called it Markdown Soup, and it's an oversaturation of the tags that are supported by Markdown as like a constraint on web page tags that you will support. And I think it's because like Markdown rendering is so common now, especially if you're like doing docs generation and things like this, that you'll constrain it so that your JavaScript and your CSS and stuff can interact with it. But they're like, you're missing all these cool tags. And so again, these are these hot takes, these like contrarian hot takes where I'm like, I agree with this. I actually think we're making the web worse by using a subset of the web as this like arbitrary constraint on what we can actually do with HTML. And HTML rendering is actually part of the markdown spec. So you can actually put in, I think a lot of people don't realize this because like GitHub has a very constrained version of markdown rendering, and they've become the de facto standard basically. Like most people are like, oh, well, this is a GitHub compliant markdown renderer, these other things. But they're using a subset. And so maybe you do want the GitHub compliant version of it. But if you wanted to have more rich interactions, it's again, if you're not a domain expert, sticking the same defaults will make you happy, right? Sticking to what most people are doing on the internet and make you happy. But if you do dive in, it allows you a little wiggle room to deviate when you know it's appropriate for your team. And knowing those trade-offs, I think, is important. And that's what, again, this is why I think it's really good that we're reading this Hypermedia book.
Yeah. Why don't we talk a bit about scripting? Because again, this to me is when the argument started to lose a bit of its luster. I think the initial idea of hypermedia, which was like, hey, make your website dead simple, right? Make it just HTML, and we've created this this library HTMX. I keep wanting to say framework, but someone in the comments told me it's not a framework, it's a library, and they are correct. So I am abiding by it. Anyhow, so like we've created this library, which that's a little bit of extra help to make rendering your HTML a little smoother. It gives you it addresses some of the fundamental defects of HTML, like they talk about, like only in HTML only a form or a button can submit an HTTP request, so they add that to every element. Really, really cool. And they say, and now you can kind of just you construct all your HTML and templates in your server, and then your server passes it back and renders it on the web page. And the web page doesn't do anything, right? It does what web pages should do. It displays HTML, and isn't that neat? So like, okay, yeah. Like, still, I was like, I don't know how many use cases there are for this, but this is an interesting approach to the web. Then we get into scripting, and they say, well, now Hypermedia wouldn't work for everything. You would need to do some scripting. So here are all the ways you could script. They gave us 3 examples: JavaScript, just vanilla JS, alpine.js, and then they created hyperscript. And this is where it starts to break down for me, because now we're doing a lot of scripting within our HTML. We're having a lot of JavaScript activity in the browser. This argument about progressive enhancement breaks down, because now if for some reason you wanted to build a website that doesn't rely on JavaScript, you can't do any of that because you're scripting now. And again, before they get into all of this, they kind of say, like, now listen, as we start to explore this, you might just want to do a single page application. We mentioned that this isn't one of Hypermedia's strong suits. We're just telling you could do this. it is about like half of the book's total content is devoted to telling us you could do this and how you could do this. So I don't know. I think for me, this is where I start to think like, wait a minute, this is just another front end scripting heavy framework. And how is this any better than React? I don't know. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. So if you stuck to there's some principles that I think if you stick to, and again, if you put this in the progressive enhancement camp, they're basically like, hey, we made this world where you don't really need client-side scripting, but if you needed to enhance it for certain things, and I will say like HTMX has some pretty clever things. You can watch these events. You can reactively watch these events in the browser for things like there's like a pre-request and a post request and several other things that you're allowed to inject some, callback state in the HTMX, swapping cycle that happens. And so you can actually do some kind of crazy stuff. Like they were showing how if you needed to like inject an auth header to certain parts, that you could actually like watch that this request was being constructed and like inject some JavaScript, and then then you just write HTMX like you normally would, and then you put these little enhancements that like allow stuff to happen. I think if you stick to that, you'll probably be pretty happy, and it's like just enough JavaScript. I think where it kind of gets crazy is when you start wanting to like duplicate the functionality of a React app that feels like a desktop application, but you're doing it with HTMX plus some JavaScript. And I think you're right. It looks, and again, full disclosure, I have not built an HTMX app that uses these JavaScript enhancements. I've not used alpine.js. If you get on the HTMX subreddit, there's like most of the stuff is either like a brand new person asking a bunch of noob questions, or somebody doing like a show and tell with something that's pretty cool looking. Right? Oh yeah, I've got some pretty neat, like this is almost all CSS with a couple of JavaScript things, HTMX with Go and Temple on the back end, and you're like, that's pretty neat, and it's very performant, and it looks kind of nice, and so like I think as a community grows, I would not be surprised if there's like the equivalent of, what is it, Shad CN? There's like the Shad CN UI. I don't know if are you familiar with that? So
those words sound familiar.
Yeah, so Shad CN UI is basically like if you're building React plus Tailscale, it's like a bunch of very sane components on how to do stuff. And what's cool about it is that you actually download the source code, and so you can make modifications to these things as you need to. Cool. But I would imagine there's going to be a world in which there's like a Shad CN UI equivalent for alpine.js plus HTMX or something, right? Like somebody basically says, hey, you need to make a drop-down form and sortable tables and a bunch of other things, and here's the HTMX way of doing this. And somebody's going to make like a library of like a CSS library with some the stuff that's like in the HTMX way of doing things, and that's interesting. I will say though, in this section, there's a bunch of quotes. I took a bunch of quotes down for this one. My favorite one is attributed to Merb, which I don't know the context of this, but they say no code is faster than no code. Which I was like, I'm going to absolutely use this.
I saw on Twitter, someone tweeted, said, whoever coined the term, coined the term, coined the term, coined the term. That's
good.
I'm like, okay.
Yeah. My daughter and I will try to see if we can trick each other with, she would say never, and I would say never say never. Like, and we would see how many recursive layers you say, and like what would the outcome of that actually mean, which is like ridiculous. I love this.
Like you only YOLO once.
Not you got it. See, this is the HTMX madness that runs the whole thing.
For any of our younger listeners, go look up what YOLO is. It was a great.
My grandpa says YOLO. Yeah.
It is funny to think that like when we're old and saying stuff like YOLO, or I'm trying to think of like, because you're about 10 years older than me, so we have overlapping slang. We're not saying stuff like bussin', or that's so fire, right? And like we're a little older than that, but
or chat, are we cooked? Are we cooked? Or yeah, it's like, yeah, you like hear some old person, they're like, wise guy, eh? You're like, you that was
I
probably
love the
like
way old
the
people talk.
yeah.
I want to talk more like that in my real life. I want to say things like drats.
I'm also just like, if you listen to the old like news anchors, you're like, did you talked faster? Did you also think faster? Have we all gotten dumber? Entirely possible.
Another good quote you pulled out, I had highlighted this too. This is from the W3C HTML design principles. In case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity.
Yes.
This kind of plays back with what I was talking about with progressive enhancement. Like, I appreciate any philosophy that's user based, or puts users first. I thought this was a good hierarchy, right? Like, and it's kind of I think what the philosophy of software design talk about this, but just this idea that like with complexity, we should care the most about the people who are interacting with the thing the most. So obviously, who is that? It's users first, then authors, then implementers, then specifiers, and theoretical purity. And I think too often we jump straight from users, or we invert this. We put theoretical purity over the concerns of the users.
Right. Yeah. There was also another one, we've talked about this a lot, especially in like software architecture. They call it separation of concerns, right? Like breaking these things out. They actually make this argument for locality of behavior.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And it fits very much in the philosophy of HTMX, and their whole idea was, and this is actually, it's not a contradiction, right? Separations of concerns are really on like how I can reason about a system, and that we this is the whole point of domain driven development and all these other areas. One of the principles, though, when we talk about coupling, is locality, and this has come up several times with all of the Agile Manifesto signers that we've had on too. There's a big asterisk, which is, well, yeah, you can have coupling though if it's local, meaning if it's close to each other. If the code's physically close to each other, it's okay to have coupling of systems. And I think HTMX is a perfect example of this, right? In an ideal annotation for HTMX, you've added behavior triggers, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, all inside of a single tag, right? Like I should be able to look at a tag or a tag and its parent and understand the expected behavior of some, piece of hypermedia interactivity. And I think if you stick to this, you're in a good spot. I think if you start doing a bunch of weird event watcher stuff where non-local behaviors happening, or you're annotating and doing all kinds of magical things, HTMX is probably a pretty bad fit, right? Unless you're doing like a really nice abstraction, like, oh, I want to inject this so that I'm not using like alerts, JavaScript alerts, because nobody wants those, but I'm using some sort of cool, HUD thing, or some sort of like breadcrumb, or some interaction that like, yeah, it's a JavaScript framework, but it's really just so I can like show do you want to delete this item, kind of alert JavaScript thing. I thought that was pragmatic, and I thought it was an interesting way of like reasoning about, should I use the scripting piece here?
Yeah, kind of related to like locality of behavior. It's something I appreciate as we've read all these books, is just getting a better understanding of the nuance of the industry. I had my brother actually, he works at the same company that I do. I'm just realizing I get he's stayed with the company about 3 months now, so I should be getting a juicy referral bonus here soon.
Nice.
Anyhow, he is a security engineer, and so he only has like one other engineer on his team, and so they're not like software engineers. Their expertise is in security, and then they kind of write like scripts and other stuff to help with their security tooling. So so it's that their expertise is security, not necessarily software engineering. And so he had got into an argument with one of the engineers, or I guess a disagreement about modularity, and like if your code should be modular. And he kind of came to me, he's like, hey, I just want to understand like if the code should be like modular, because isn't modular always best? And you know, a year ago, I probably would have said like, oh yeah, like everything should be a class, right? Everything should be super modular. And I said, I'm like, send me examples. What did you write? What did they write? Let me look into this. Because that's something I've thought about too, which is like this idea of kind of like locality of behavior. And I don't know, sometimes when you split something up into multiple classes, John Osterhout talks about that, right? Where like sometimes it's better to have a method that's 80 lines long than a method that's 5 or, you know, like 7 lines long, but calls 7 sub methods. It's nice to see it all kind of laid out. After I looked at both their approaches, I thought my brother had the better approach. But you know, I think a year ago, before reading all these books, I would have just been like, oh no, yeah, modularity. And so like, yeah, it's cool. It's cool to feel your understanding of, you know, all the different trade-offs in the industry increasing.
So I think when we're both agreement. So we're nodding our heads and I'm like, okay. And the plain JavaScript, I'm like, oh, that looks kind of painful. And then I'm like, oh, okay, alpine.js, I see it simplifies some things. It kind of abstracts it in a very HTMX friendly way if you need to add some additional JavaScript behavior. And I will tell you, if you go to the HTMX subreddit, alpine.js is a very popular tool to pair with this. Hyperscript. Oh boy. I don't know what to think about this. I kind of oscillate between thinking it's very clever and then thinking I'm being trolled right now. So I hate natural languages. Like I hate them. I hate them with a passion. They're very easy to read, and they're incredibly hard to write.
Yeah.
And I don't know anyone who's ever enjoyed natural language because it's too much expressiveness, in my opinion. When I'm talking to a computer, I need to break it down to like logical chunks. I need to be able to say like, does this expression resolve to some Boolean thing that I agree with, right? Like, especially if I'm putting like an if clause, right, in front of something. Natural language expression of if clauses are a nightmare because they're just like, you're either putting filler words that you don't need, or I think I understand what this means in this natural language expression, but I actually don't. And there's like a bunch of weird side effects. I feel like debugging this would be a nightmare, truly.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I mean, I admire anyone that creates their own programming language. That was it was a class I wasn't able to fit into my master's. I really wanted to take a class on like compilers and like how programming languages are created. I wasn't able to get it in, and I need to. We should read a book on that sometime, just because the theory behind that I'm not super confident on. So listen, you know, Gross, Akşimşek, and who's the other one? Stepinski.
I actually put how to like. I think I have a book on how to build an interpreter.
Yeah,
it gets us pretty far along, right? You're still dealing with like abstract syntax trees, which, you know, every big brain out there is like an AST guru. And I have not spent enough time with ASTs, to be honest.
Yeah, well, we should cover that sometime.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
But yeah, I mean, I agree. I just think it's interesting, but I don't love natural languages, like you said. And just the more and more we get into this, the more I think like, listen, if there were a world where this were just as popular as React, and I'm a freshman, or, you know, a newly graduated CS major, right, coming out of college, and I have to choose my path, right? I can be a React guy or an HTMX guy. You know, I can see doing HTMX, but I mean, and this is part of the problem with like HTMX. React is the incumbent. HTMX is the upstart. When you're the upstart, you need to offer some really compelling reason to switch away from React. Because I can say to people, well, it's not any more complicated than React. I'm like, I know, but React is the default. I felt it got a little, right. It's a little too much for me.
Yeah,
but I'll also say, for me, I'm boring when it comes to my tech choices. Like, I'm actually playing around with the idea of like, I have like maybe a business I'd like to start. And so I'm just working on some prototypes, but like, what is the front end written in? React Native. What is the back end? It is Java Lambdas. right? Like I am not like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to do the, it's going to be Go, and then the front end is Flutter, and then, it's all going to run on Vercel. Like that is just not me. I'm very much like the tried and true. So I'm not the easiest convert to something like HTMX. But it's it's an approach.
Yep. Let's see. I'm just looking.
Can we talk about how they separated JSON data APIs from hypermedia driven applications?
Yes, I loved this. This was probably one of my favorite hot takes in the book.
Okay, explain it to me. I was very confused by all this. Just like,
so they're basically saying you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So they lament the fact that REST APIs have become these JSON data APIs, and that they're
really hung up on that. Like, if you're exchanging JSON, it's not actually REST. I'm like,
right.
I don't care.
And so REST was originally, again, was this way of constructing how HTML and XML and structured data was rendered, with where the state of the system was expressed through the URLs and the verbs that you use to call those URLs, and the idea here though is that like data APIs are a different thing, that they're much more like an RPC, right? That the idea that there's a lot of assumptions on how you use the data, that you have to strictly version it. People are relying on the structure and format of it. Where like a REST endpoint, in the traditional sense, again in the Roy Fielding state of it, the person who coined the terms hypermedia and dealt with REST in his research, he also is like, he goes, I think this is the quote, "I'm getting frustrated by the number of people calling any HTTP-based interface a REST API. Today's example is the social site REST API. That is an RPC. It screams RPC. There's so much coupling on display that it should be given an X rating. That needs to be done." I feel like grabbing a drink with this guy would be hilarious. The REST architecture style to clear the notion that hypertext is a constraint. In other words, if the engine of application state, and hence the API, is not being driven by hypertext, then it cannot be RESTful and cannot be a REST API. So this is like a get off my lawn quote. Yeah. And so, I think that they're basically saying, look, we've watered down the term REST API so much that it's meaningless, and that we basically just mean JSON data API, when those are two different arguments. And
but now they're proposing creating a JSON data API side by side with your REST, your hypermedia API. Yeah. This is another one where I was like, what? Why? Because I thought the original idea in like the first half of the book was interesting, where they're basically saying like, listen, your user doesn't care about JSON data. The browser doesn't care about JSON data. The browser, at the end of the day, needs HTML. So why are you returning JSON data to it and then having this thick client in the browser convert that into HTML? They say, just return the HTML, right? Like, you know what? That's an interesting idea. But then they're saying, but you might actually need a JSON data API. And so if that's the case, you need to split the two out. And now I have my REST, hypermedia API, my JSON data API, and like you got to keep those two in sync. And I was just like, ugh. So I don't know about this.
Going back to my lift plan webpage, I made it so that you could ask for the content type to be JSON. Oh, so nice. I because again, no one uses it. No one uses this except for me on the whole planet. Until now. I'm gonna start getting some issues in my issue tracker. This didn't work right. I'm like,
one of our users, this doesn't work in Internet Explorer.
But the cool part, I will say, where he talks about here is that like HTMX is not saying that other servers should consume your HTML. That is not what they're saying. So like you don't need to parse HTML server to server. So if your contacts app, right?
Sure.
Could be consumed by another part of your system. And they actually say, don't use the content, the application content header, that it gets a little too confusing, that the REST verbs can be a little different.
Yeah.
And so do a slash API, because you might want to have it where it's versioned and stuff. But I will say, I didn't have to write any significant code to make my JSON endpoint work on my Lambdas.
That's fair.
I literally just said, if the header says it wants JSON, then serialize it this way. And if
Yeah,
it doesn't,
yeah.
render the HTML, right? Like it basically like it's like an if that it's like 5 lines of code.
Right.
And
you could have some sort of common function that everything gets
well, they said
parsed
if
through,
you follow the model view controller, right, the MVC pattern, that you're really you really have like a pretty thin layer of business logic that you have to do to like convert it to the different data types. And so I think again, you have to be thoughtful. You have to do this in a way that makes sense for your organization, but you can support, you know, the idea of like an HTMX HTML endpoint and then also have a data endpoint. And again, we take a step back. This is Next.js has a very popular framework for this, right? And they actually have this is built into their MVC, opinionated MVC structure. You can define a bunch of API endpoints, and you can share that server-side logic between what renders all the page views that you have, and then what ends up being consumed by the API endpoint. And you can write completely separate logic if you wanted to, but they actually encourage you to have some common libraries that are, you know, like if you need to get a list of users, well, that list of users server-side function should probably be consumed by both the API endpoint and have some JSON return value, or the web render that you're doing, in which, you know, all the components get put together and you've got all the beautiful page stuff, and then like the list of users are in, you know, some component inside of it. So again, I'm nodding my head in the sense that like both communities are actually solving this problem in an interesting way, in which you're like, oh yeah, I do actually need a data feed endpoint. And that's actually like, that's just a lot of people talk about this, like they call it API first development, right?
Mhm.
This idea that like everything you do in a UI should be expressible in an API endpoint. I'm a huge fan of that. I think it's easier to troubleshoot. I think it's easier to make contracts across things in a composable web kind of stuff. So yeah. Oh, last little note, we're kind of skipping over this. There's also this thing called Hyperview. The last third of the book, and I will tell you, it's basically a repeat of the HTMX section with all the like nuanced aspects of what Hyperview is. I will tell you that like it's an even harder pill to swallow for me, for all the reasons that we've brought up. So it's interesting in that they're like, hey, we're putting it's a React Native kind of wrapper around XML. And the XML is structured in a way to like look a lot like HTMX. It's called HXML, so Hyper XML, right?
Okay.
And it's interesting, and they're arguing as to like, oh, you know, well, if you do it this way, then you don't have to like resubmit to the App Store because all the logic's happening on your servers and do all these things. But again, if you're using a modern React Native framework, you have hot reload built in. Most of that logic can actually be injected. The thing that you lose, and I think is like a showstopper for me, is you don't get offline first. And I think offline first is something that we haven't really talked about. But I think if it's, I'm a huge fan of the offline first movement, both for web development and for mobile development, which is this idea that there should be the same set of behaviors that an app can do when in offline mode, right? Yeah. If you use the HTMX by itself can't do this. It cannot support an offline mode. There is some weird stuff. I actually have a buddy who is making this like this personal grocery app that also like keeps track of all of his recipes. He can build like a grocery list out of recipe that he wants to do and all these other kind of cool things. He actually built it in HTMX in Rust. He's a Rust programmer. He figured out how to do HTMX offline, and you have to basically use like a service workers framework, and the service workers actually like intercept network calls. And so he had to like write some service worker code that cached the network calls. And then what will happen is that it'll try to pull the cache from the service worker before it goes out to the public internet. So it's doable. But again, ergonomically, I don't think that that's actually like the most user-friendly way of doing stuff. Like service workers are kind of like a weird opaque thing. And you have to think about like your caching abstraction, all these other things. It's the same with this. It's like, okay, well, there's no built-in way of doing offline first. And they actually bring up the contacts app, right? context app is this big thing that we've been doing HTMX this whole time. And I'm like, this is actually the worst example of why you should use Hyperview, because your contacts don't change that much.
Uh-huh.
You
They speak for yourself. I'm a busy man.
Right. Yeah. Maybe you've got, 20 people contributing to your contacts app all the time, which again, if that's the case, if the data gets stale quickly, and again, social media,
Sure.
I really wish they would have done something like a Twitter feed or something where it's basically useless if you don't have internet. There doesn't need to be a very wonderful offline first approach to a X or Blue Sky profile. Except for maybe to tell you you're offline and you can't see anything. And but contacts, I'm like, okay, they're like, oh yeah, and so when you search, each one of the search results are like dynamically hitting the server, and I'm like, this sounds horrible. Like, why am I making network calls to like filter a list of contacts that should probably just live on my phone, and I should just reference those locally? And so it was a good example of just like, yes, I guess. But if you have like an e-commerce site or something like this, then sure. Like, yeah, like your e-commerce or your social media site or whatever are basically useless on offline mode. So you could take this like hypermedia first approach, and there's some nice things you get from it. But yeah, that was my hot take. I don't know if you had any opinions about the mobile HTMX to mobile. Again, I feel like it was a step too far.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I find this book interesting as a thought exercise, when it gets more into like, I don't know. And here are the concrete steps you can take to replace everything you do with HTMX. I'm just like, I'm good, fellas.
Right.
Well, I mean, is there anything else we want to cover before we kind of wrap up?
To wrap up, let me see. I did like the conclusion was really nice. There, let's see. Again, I appreciate this. This is like right before there's like a pause and reflect section, but right before it, they say the hypermedia driven application approach is not right for every application. For many applications, though, the increased flexibility and simplicity of hypermedia can be a huge benefit. Even if your application wouldn't benefit from this approach, it's worthwhile to understand the approach, its strengths and its weaknesses, and how it differs from the approach you're taking. The original web grew faster than any distributed system in history. Web developers should know how to tap that power of the underlying technologies that made that growth possible. And I think that's a wonderful reflection, right? Like, and it's what we're doing here. Like, even if Carter never writes a line of HTMX, I think it's a good influence on knowing the trade-offs of doing server-side versus browser-based. If somebody on your team proposes something that feels hypermedia-ish, you're like, yeah, I think for this, quick and dirty thing that we're going to spend 4 hours on, sure, go for it, buddy.
I spiritually connected with this book, in that I guess a double meaning of the word spiritually. But I am a Latter-day Saint, a Mormon. That's sometimes what people call us. And I was a missionary for my church, and I am very familiar with very sincerely explaining your beliefs to a party who is not that interested, right? And that's kind of how I felt about this book. I'm like, I see your passion, fellas. You make some good arguments. I'm happy. I'm happy with React. I'm not looking to convert at this point. I have heard that more times in my life than across those 2 years than most people will have in their entire lifetime. So I get it, and I appreciate. I have a lot of respect for anyone who believes strongly in something and makes a case for it, right? Even if I don't always agree with it. So I have a lot of respect for this book. I have a lot of respect for the men who wrote this book. I would love for us to be able to talk with some of them. Is it for me? Not so much. But it really is a reminder of just how many smart and cool people work in this industry.
Yeah.
And it's one of our big blessings working in this industry. It's just how many cool ideas we're exposed to.
And who knows, maybe next year there's going to be a new server render framework called Hyper React that is and then you'll be like, oh yeah, I know these patterns.
Yeah. That's what we got to do. We got to fuse React and HTMX, and
it's a hyper reaction framework. Yeah.
Well, so we've now read all of Hypermedia Systems. Like we say, very, very interesting, if not directly applicable. But I think it's good. I think it's good to have books like these in the podcast, right? To expand our horizons a little bit. And you know, we'll always learn something from every book we read. So Nathan, I mean, what are you going to do differently in your career because of having read this book?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to be I'm investigating a project that will use HTMX. So there's a personal one, but it actually could bleed over into some work. There's actually we have some constraints. We have a team that's like trying to minimize the attack surface of a JavaScript world. So we wouldn't be using like an alpine.js most likely. This would be pretty restricted setup where I think HTMX would actually bridge that gap so that it's actually increases the things. I also may kick the tires and refactor lift plan with HTMX because I think it would be fun. It'd be fun to be like, oh, I haven't touched this code in years. Like I can roast myself on that. And then luckily it has very good test coverage. So I think I can confidently refactor it.
There you go.
Yeah. And yeah, but what about you? What are you going to do differently?
You know, we didn't get to talk about this too much in the podcast, but they make a great argument for writing better semantic HTML, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like I fall into like the div soup, you know, like everything is a div too often. So I'd like to be better at writing some semantic HTML, or I guess, you know, semantic JSX is more what I would be writing.
It'll be prettier code, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, somebody should be able to look at, especially it's like a gift to yourself in the future. You're like, go back to it and you're like, oh yeah, look at me.
Yeah. There we go.
I used the nav tag.
Well, and who would you recommend this book to, Nathan?
Same as last week. So I still think squarely, I said contrarian front-end engineers or back-end software engineers who want to write sane front ends. That doesn't change. I think this book that's a target audience for me in my mind.
Yeah, I would recommend this to anyone who has a good understanding of the current popular web frameworks like React and is looking for a different perspective. I think if you're a new engineer and you either are just kind of struggling to understand React, or maybe you don't, you know, maybe you're a backend engineer looking to break into a framework, like I don't know if I would recommend this and say, you know what, you should really look at HTMX. I think your time is just going to be better spent understanding what currently is dominating the market. But if you are really familiar with React and you know how it is, sometimes when you have a hammer, when all you have is a hammer, you think every problem's a nail, right? Reading this could give you a really interesting perspective on not just all the problems React can solve, but what are the problems with, you know, building a web app in general, and what are some things that React isn't doing well that this is? And maybe that doesn't mean you're going to pick up HTMX and run with it, but maybe it means that there are some changes you can make to your React application to more fully embrace some of the philosophies that the authors are advocating here. But yeah, I mean, I think that wraps it up for Hypermedia Systems. Very interesting book. What a ride. What do you think, Nathan?
I thought it was great. And yeah, I'm really hoping that when we reach out to the authors, we get to chat with some of them, especially you know, obviously Carson Gross, he's just great to hear like his perspective on things. I've seen him talk elsewhere. But I would love the other two authors would be really great too, especially the author of Hyperview. Like win me over. Like I would love to, because from an engineering standpoint, I thought it was a fascinating perspective. I think there are cases in which it would be really cool, but it's not where I am in my world. And so I would love to hear, you know, what was motivation for building it and these other pieces.
Yeah, this is interesting. And one reason I'd love to talk to the authors is pretty much every book we've read up until this point, we have enjoyed and been very complimentary of, or I said, well, that implies we didn't enjoy this book. We did enjoy this book. We have mostly agreed with the books. There has been a book or two that we have started reading and we have stopped and said, you know what, we just couldn't in good conscience. This isn't high quality enough, and we don't want to spend an episode roasting an author who very sincerely put this book together, right? This one is different in that, like, we recognize the high quality of writing, we recognize the intelligence of the authors, not sold on all of the arguments. So I would love to, I'd love to be convinced.
Yeah. Cool.
Carson Gross, if you're listening to this, respond to my email. I think that wraps it up. You can always contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can check out the schedule at www.bookoverflow.io. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can find us on Twitter at BookOverflowPod. You can find Nathan his work with Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com. We will be back next week with team topologies, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. Like we said, we're trying to find that balance between technical stuff versus less technical stuff. So team topologies will be a good read. If I'm understanding correctly, I don't think it's specifically computer science oriented. I think it's just about teams in general, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not either. I mean, it's come up so many times with our interviews with authors. I think, especially the ThoughtWorks folks are huge fans.
Really into it.
And especially because they said like this is beyond all the inverse Conway maneuver stuff. Is that you don't really understand the framing until you understand team topologies, and I'm like, cool, I need to understand this.
And then so we'll be back with that next week, and then we record this podcast Friday mornings now, and Thursday is when Severance comes out. So I just spend all like, oh my gosh, Severance. So if you're not watching Severance, go watch Severance. And I think that's about it for this week. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and we will see you around.
See ya.